It's Batman vs. Godzilla in the ultimate showdown of can tech beat terror. When it comes to fighting massive monsters, there are two kinds of people in the world. One thinks Batman is all talk and no action when it comes to taking on giant kites. But what if we gave the caped crusader some serious firepower? Hi, I'm your host, and today we're answering the question, can tech beat terror by pitting the Dark Knight's Batarang against the king of the monsters, Godzilla? Will the Batarang be able to take down the gigantic lizard, or will it be another case of property damage in Tokyo Bay? Let's get into it. The Batarang is one of Batman's most famous weapons. The bat-shaped throwing tool has been featured heavily in Batman comics since its first appearance in Detective Comics number 173 back in May of 1943. Since then, the Batarang has gone through several design iterations and made of various materials, but we'll focus on the standard comic book version here. It's not quite clear who designed the first Bat. Usually, fans attribute its invention to either Batman himself or his trusted butler, Alfred. In the comics, Batman has demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate his enemies' movements, meaning he could hurl the Batarang with pinpoint accuracy even at moving targets. It can also spin rapidly, allowing for longer range throws and more erratic flight patterns, confusing the target before striking. And in some versions of Batman lore, the Batarang's aerodynamic shape allows the user to ride it like a skateboard after throwing it. But enough about its history. What actually makes the Batarang tick? Well, it doesn't really have any moving parts or a power source. It's just a flat piece of metal with a pointed tip and a razor-sharp edge that can cut through almost anything, solid objects and human flesh alike. However, it shouldn't be confused with Batman's other famous projectile, the Bat Dart. The Bat Dart is often used when Batman needs a bit more punch behind his ranged attacks. The darts feature two sharp metal points instead of one, and are sometimes coated with a poison called Venoma, which can paralyze its victim. Both weapons share many similarities, but it's the regular Batarang that holds up better under scientific scrutiny. In the comics, they state the Batarang is made out of a fictional super-dense metal called adamantium, which would make the average Batarang weigh around 2 pounds, slightly heavier than the real-world metal of choice for throwing stars steel. And this fictitious metal has one key difference from its real-life counterpart. It can't be destroyed by conventional weapons fire. We've seen Batman's Batarang deflect bullets, explosions, and even energy blasts from villains with energy manipulation powers. So it is safe to assume that Godzilla's atomic breath won't be able to destroy the Batarang. But the real question is, will the Batarang be able to scratch Godzilla? To answer that question, let's look at the Batarang's performance in previous showdowns with other giant monsters. Now, there isn't a ton of crossover between the Batman and Godzilla universes. The closest thing to Godzilla appearing in Batman's neck of the woods was in Batman and Dracula, Red Rain, where Batman has to team up with the Teen Titans to stop the blood-caped crusader from draining the life out of humanity. Now, while not technically a kaiju, Dracula does possess superhuman strength and durability, and we see the Batarang make quick work of him. Dracula is hit with a Batarang and is sliced open. The Batarang bounces off a wooden stake that's holding the villain down. Even with his supernatural resilience, Dracula is easily dispatched. This seems promising for the Batarang's chances against Godzilla, except Dracula is nowhere near as durable as the king of the monsters, and that's just scratching the surface of Godzilla's abilities. The sheer destructive capabilities of the Big G were best summarized by Doctor Who. When facing off against the Daleks, Godzilla stated, "You cannot kill me. You do not have my kind of power. You have no idea what I'm capable of," before obliterating the Daleks, so it's safe to say he's pretty tough. And while it might take a while for the full extent of his powers to be revealed, Godzilla was able to go toe-to-toe with King Ghidorah, one of the most powerful kaijus in existence. While the exact specifics of the matchup changed across different iterations, Godzilla usually had the upper hand against his three-headed alien opponent. At times, Godzilla was even able to overpower King Ghidorah, despite being trapped inside a force field, which allowed the villain to absorb his atomic breath and redirect it right back at him. So how exactly did Godzilla manage to win these fights? Well, part of it had to do with his size. The king of the monsters typically towers over most other measuring at least 100 feet tall and weighing over 60,000 tons. Even though the Batarang is sturdy, a direct hit from a baseball-sized chunk of adamantium would be able to penetrate Godzilla's thick hide. That's unless the Batarang was hurled at the colossal lizard at supersonic speeds. This is possible thanks to Batman's skill as a martial artist and acrobat. He's shown catching, speeding motorcycles and cars with the bat, so it's not inconceivable that he could launch the projectile fast enough to pierce Godzilla's skin, but it would have to be one heck of a throw. And even if it did penetrate Godzilla's skin, the real challenge would be reaching his brain. A human skull is roughly 5 centimeters thick, but that's only the beginning. An adult human brain sits inside a protective bony cavity known as the cranial cavity, which varies in thickness between 2 to 3 centimeters. This is much thicker than the skull itself, because the brain is soft and vulnerable, so evolution has ensured it's well protected. And because the brain is the control center of the body, it makes sense that incapacitating the central nervous system would end a fight quicker than destroying the rest of the body. Godzilla's head looks vaguely reptilian, so it's safe to assume he has a similar protective mechanism. If the Batarang managed to burrow a hole into the side of Godzilla's head, it would still need to penetrate 5 centimeters of bone, then navigate another 3 centimeters of empty space before reaching the brain itself. After all that, the Batarang would finally be able to inflict lethal damage by severing the connections between the brain and the spinal cord, even if it successfully reached the brain, though it's hard to say whether or not the Batarang would be able to sever the connection. Human brains are extremely delicate, with even a small amount of physical trauma causing lasting damage. Unfortunately, science doesn't know much about the inner workings of kaiju physiology, so we don't know exactly what the structure of Godzilla's brain looks like. If it's anything like a human brain though, it's not going to be easy to split in half. And that's just one path for the Batarang to take. In order to defeat the monstrous reptile, the Batarang would need to completely avoid the limbs and torso, both of which are incredibly tough and offer little else in the way of protection. It would be like trying to reach the driver in a car while avoiding the doors, windows, seats and steering wheel. And to add to the difficulty, the car would periodically breathe atomic fire and is the size of a building. If Batman wants to stand a chance of taking down Godzilla, he needs something with more punch, and thankfully, he's got just the thing. Check out our next episode, where we ask, can tech beat terror when Batman's Batmobile takes on the king of the monsters? Now, some of you may have noticed something peculiar about the Bat. It didn't actually seem to obey the laws of physics. That's because we haven't talked about aerodynamics yet. The Batarang's actual ability to fly depends on several factors, including its weight, shape, velocity and the forces of gravity and drag. Now, the weight of the Batarang would remain unchanged, but its shape would be altered as it spun end over end. If the Batarang were thrown without spinning, it would fly in a straight line, but it would quickly drop to the ground due to Earth's gravitational pull. The force of gravity acting on the Batarang would depend on its mass and the distance between it and Godzilla. But adding spin to the Batarang changes things dramatically. Because of the conservation of angular momentum, the Batarang remains aloft for longer. This is why spinning a coin on its edge allows it to stay upright for longer. But the Batarang would eventually slow down, and as it did, the force of gravity would cause it to plummet toward the Earth. If Batman wanted to increase the time the Batarang spends in the air, he'd need to throw it faster or change its shape while it's airborne. As long as the Batarang continues to spin, it'll remain airborne, and the faster it spins, the longer it stays aloft. That said, the Batarang would face stiff competition from the force of drag. The resistance of the air molecules the Batarang collides with would depend on its speed. The faster it goes, the more force of drag it experiences. So the Batarang would need to spin faster to compensate, creating an aerodynamically stable version of the projectile. To figure out how fast the Batarang would need to spin, we can use the following equation. First, multiply the moment of inertia of the Batarang by its angular velocity squared, and then divide it by the force of gravity. This will give us the minimum height of the Batarang above the ground. The moment of inertia is a measure of an object's resistance to changes in its rotation. For simplicity's sake, we'll assume the Batarang is a thin, flat object that rotates around its center. The moment of inertia for such an object is calculated by multiplying the mass of the bat by the square of the distance between its center and the furthest point on its edge. As for angular velocity, that's simply the number of rotations per second multiplied by 2 pi radians. Now, all we need is the mass and dimensions of the Batarang. Using the average values from several comic book appearances, we find the mass to be 2 pounds or 0.9 kilograms and the length to be 12 inches or 30.48 centimeters. Plugging these values into the equation, we find that the minimum height of the Batarang would be 0.43 meters or 13.9 inches. Not bad, but not nearly enough to strike Godzilla. At this point, the Batarang would need to spin faster to achieve greater height. The faster it spins, the more force is required to keep it aloft. Eventually, the force required to keep the Batarang spinning would exceed Batman's strength, forcing the Batarang to drop to the ground and ending the fight. If Batman wants to stand a chance of taking down Godzilla, he needs more than just a bat. Luckily, he's got just the thing. Check out our next episode, where we ask, can tech beat terror when Batman's Batmobile takes on the king of the monsters? Will the Dark Knight prevail? Or will the big guy just blow away the Batmobile? Could Batman take down Godzilla? Comment below. And do you forget to subscribe so you're re-notified every time we answer the ultimate scientific questions of our time. I've been your host. Until next time, remember, the Batarang is not a toy.